On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler sat in his underground bunker at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia and delivered a verdict on American soldiers that would seal the fate of his last great offensive. He told his generals that American troops were soft, undisciplined, and incapable of withstanding the shock of concentrated assault. They were businessmen playing at war, he said. They lacked the martial spirit of German soldiers. One hard blow would send them running. 500 miles to the west, in the frozen forests of eastern Belgium, a 20-year-old first lieutenant named Lyle Bouck Jr. crouched in a snow-covered foxhole with 17 other men from the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment. They had never seen combat. They had been on the front line for barely 5 weeks. They were about to face 500 German paratroopers, supported by the most feared armoured formation in the Wehrmacht. Hitler believed the Americans would break. Bouck and his men were about to prove him catastrophically wrong. The misjudgment began months before the first shot was fired. In the autumn of 1944, as Allied armies pushed toward the German frontier, Hitler's own generals watched their Führer with growing concern. The war was clearly lost. Soviet armies were pushing through Poland toward Germany's eastern borders. American and British forces had broken out of Normandy and liberated Paris. The strategic situation was hopeless by any rational assessment, but Hitler was not interested in rational assessments. He conceived a plan so audacious that many of his own generals thought it was insane. He would launch a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes, the same forested region where German forces had shattered the French army in May 1940. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, would smash through the thinly held American lines, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in 2. The offensive would force the Western powers to negotiate peace, freeing Germany to concentrate against the Soviet threat in the east. It was Hitler's last gamble, his final attempt to reverse the tide of a war that was clearly slipping away. German military planners compiled reports on the American divisions holding the Ardennes sector. The conclusions were remarkably consistent. The area was defended by a mixture of battle-weary divisions recovering from heavy combat and green divisions that had never faced enemy fire. Intelligence assessments noted that the 99th Infantry Division, which held nearly 19 miles of front from Monschau to Losheim, fell into the second category. They had arrived in Europe only 2 months earlier. Their soldiers were young and inexperienced. They were spread dangerously thin across terrain that German doctrine considered ideal for offensive operations. Hitler's advisors told him these green Americans would collapse under the weight of a surprise attack. The plan specifically targeted the boundary between the 99th Division and the even more inexperienced 106th Infantry Division to the south. German planners calculated that green troops would panic when faced with concentrated assault by veteran formations. They would abandon their positions and flee westward, creating gaps that German armour could exploit. This assessment was not unreasonable given the available evidence. The 99th Division had been classified as combat-ready only a few months before deployment. Most of its soldiers had never heard a shot fired in anger. The division's assigned sector was over 3 times the length that Army doctrine recommended for a single division. They had no reserve. If the line broke at any point, there was nothing behind it. German officers who had fought Americans before, during the North African campaign and in Normandy, reported mixed assessments. Some American units had fought well. Others had broken under pressure. The key variable seemed to be experience. Veteran American divisions could be formidable opponents, but green divisions, units that had never faced the chaos and terror of modern combat, were another matter entirely. Hitler's own prejudices reinforced these assessments. He had long believed that Americans were a mongrel race, lacking the martial traditions and racial purity that he believed gave German soldiers their fighting edge. American democracy, he argued, produced soft men who valued comfort over sacrifice. They might have superior equipment, but they lacked the will to use it effectively. A sudden shock would collapse their resistance entirely. The German force arrayed against the 99th Division's sector was formidable by any measure. 1st SS Panzer Corps, commanded by SS Gruppenführer Hermann Priess, included some of Nazi Germany's most elite formations. These were not ordinary Wehrmacht units. They were ideologically committed SS troops, many of whom had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets and emerged as hardened combat veterans. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler unter SS Standartenführer Wilhelm Mohnke was Hitler's original bodyguard unit expanded into a full armoured division. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend unter SS Standartenführer Hugo Kraas had been formed from members of the Hitler Youth and had earned a fearsome reputation for fanatical resistance during the Normandy campaign. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division under General Major Gerhard Engel and the 277th Volksgrenadier Division under Oberst Wilhelm Wiebig would provide the infantry strength. The 3rd Parachute Division would spearhead the initial assault. The tip of the spear was Kampfgruppe Piper, a combined arms battle group commanded by 29-year-old SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper. Piper was a former adjutant to Heinrich Himmler himself, a man who had risen through the ranks of the SS through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless aggression. His battle group comprised 4,800 men and approximately 800 vehicles, including roughly 40 Panther medium tanks, over 30 Panzer IV medium tanks, and 45 of the massive Tiger II heavy tanks. The Tiger II, known to the Allies as the King Tiger, was the most powerful tank in the world. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its armor was virtually impenetrable to American anti-tank weapons. This was the elite of the elite, veterans of the Eastern Front, battle-hardened killers who had never known defeat. They were being sent against a division of American soldiers who had never fired their weapons in combat. Against this force stood the 99th Infantry Division, a unit that existed on paper for only 2 years before the German offensive. The division was activated on November 15, 1942, at Camp Van Dorn in Centerville, Mississippi. Their commander, Major General Walter Lauer, later described the installation as a tar paper shantytown sprawled across the red mud of the Deep South. It was a hastily constructed facility, one of dozens built across America to house the rapidly expanding wartime army. The division's distinctive blue and white checkerboard shoulder patch derived from the coat of arms of William Pitt the Elder, honoring Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the division had been originally headquartered during the interwar period. The patch would become famous during the Battle of the Bulge, but in the autumn of 1944, it was just another symbol on the shoulders of soldiers who had yet to prove themselves. Training extended nearly 2 years across multiple installations. After completing individual unit and combined training at Camp Van Dorn through September 1943, the division participated in the grueling Louisiana maneuvers. These large-scale exercises were designed to test divisions under simulated combat conditions, but they could only approximate the reality of facing an enemy who was trying to kill you. The division then transferred to Camp Maxey near Paris, Texas, in November 1943. There they completed post-maneuver training and conducted field exercises opposing the 12th Armored Division. Major General Walter Lauer assumed command on August 2, 1943, bringing genuine combat experience to an otherwise untested formation. Born June 29, 1893 in Brooklyn, New York, Lyle was a career army officer who had served on the Western Front in World War I. More importantly, he had landed with the 3rd Infantry Division at Fadala during Operation Torch on November 8, 1942, the Allied invasion of North Africa. He had seen combat against German and Vichy French forces. He knew what it was like to be shot at. Unlike his division, Lauer understood what they were about to face. The division comprised 3 infantry regiments, the 393rd, 394th, and 395th, supported by 4 artillery battalions, the 370th, 371st, 372nd, and 924th Field Artillery, the 324th Engineer Combat Battalion, the 99th Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop, and standard divisional support units brought the total strength to approximately 15,000 men. In March 1944, the division received 2,900 soldiers from the Army's Specialized Training Program. These were college-educated men who had been studying at universities across America before the Army's need for combat infantry forced the program's cancellation. They were intellectually capable, but militarily inexperienced. Many had never held a rifle before entering the Army. Now they would be expected to fight against battle-hardened Wehrmacht divisions. The 99th earned its green classification through simple mathematics, 0 combat experience before December 16, 1944. They departed Boston on September 30, 1944, crossed the Atlantic in convoy, and arrived in England by October 10 and 11. After brief staging, they crossed to Le Havre, France, on November 3 and made their way to the front. Between November 9 and 14 they relieved elements of the 5th Armoured Division and 9th Infantry Division in the Ardennes sector. By December 16, when the German offensive struck, they had been in the line for just over a month, and those weeks had been remarkably quiet. The Ardennes was considered a rest area, a quiet sector where recovering divisions could rebuild their strength and new divisions could gain experience without facing heavy combat. The occasional patrol, the random artillery shell, the infrequent sniper. Nothing that would prepare them for what was coming. Their assigned sector, spanning nearly 19 miles from Monschau in the north to Losheim in the south, was far too large for a single division to defend effectively. Army doctrine recommended approximately 5 to 7 miles of front per division under normal conditions. The 99th held more than 3 times that distance. Every rifle company was committed to the front. Every battalion was in the line. The margin for error was 0. United Press correspondent John McDermott would later coin their nickname, Battle Babies. It captured both their youth and their inexperience. The average age of the division's soldiers was somewhere in the early 20s. Many were teenagers. They had trained for nearly 2 years, but training could only do so much. Combat was different. Combat separated the men who could function under fire from those who could not. No one knew which category the Battle Babies would fall into. German planners saw them as lambs, waiting for slaughter. But the German analysis contained a fatal flaw that would prove catastrophic. They measured American potential by American performance in peacetime conditions. They saw a division that had not fought and concluded it could not fight. They saw young soldiers who had never faced enemy fire and assumed those soldiers would run when the shooting started. They looked at the 99th Infantry Division and saw what they expected to see. Soft Americans, green troops, easy targets. They did not see what the 99th had been doing during those quiet 5 weeks on the line. They did not see the extensive defensive positions the division had constructed, log-covered foxholes with overhead protection against artillery, redundant communication trenches connecting positions, pre-registered artillery targets on every likely German approach route, overlapping fields of fire that would channel attackers into kill zones. The work was backbreaking. The ground was frozen solid in many places, requiring hours of effort to dig even a shallow fighting position. Soldiers cut trees and hauled logs through the snow to build overhead cover. They strung communication wire mile after mile through the forest. They conducted patrols to identify likely enemy approach routes and calculated firing data for every crossroad, every clearing, every terrain feature that might be useful to an attacker. Some soldiers grumbled about the work. What was the point of all this digging and building in a quiet sector? The war was clearly winding down. Germany was on the verge of collapse. Surely they would not have to actually use these positions. But Major General Lyle insisted. He had seen combat. He knew that war was unpredictable. He knew that the quiet could end at any moment. So his men dug and built and prepared, creating a network of defenses that would prove devastatingly effective when the attack came. The Germans who dismissed these preparations as the busy work of green troops were wrong about everything. At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, the frozen pre-dawn silence of the Ardennes exploded into chaos. Approximately 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. It was the largest German artillery barrage of the war on the Western Front. Shells screamed through the darkness, exploding among American positions, cutting communication lines, destroying equipment, and killing men who had been sleeping moments before. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. 90 minutes of continuous bombardment that turned the forest into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel. Trees shattered, foxholes collapsed. Men who had never experienced combat suddenly found themselves buried alive or bleeding from wounds they could not see in the darkness. The carefully maintained communication lines were cut within the first minutes. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Company commanders lost contact with their platoons. The fog of war descended before the battle had even properly begun. 20 minutes after the bombardment lifted, German infantry attacked the 99th Division at 5 separate points along its extended front. This was not a probing attack or a reconnaissance in force. This was a full-scale offensive designed to shatter the American line and open the roads westward for the waiting Panzer divisions. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division struck the 393rd and 395th Infantry Regiments near the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. These Belgian villages, so close together that they were often referred to as a single location, sat astride a crucial road junction. Whoever controlled Krinkelt and Rocherath controlled access to Elsenborn Ridge, and whoever controlled Elsenborn Ridge controlled the northern shoulder of the entire German offensive. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division advanced through the 394th Infantry sector toward the crucial road junction at Lossheimergraben. This position controlled access to the road network that Kampfgruppe Peiper needed to advance westward. Without Lossheimergraben, the German armour would be stuck on secondary roads, unsuitable for rapid advance. At Lanzerath, the 3rd Parachute Division attacked what appeared to be a tiny outpost. German commanders expected to sweep it aside in minutes and continue their advance. They were wrong. That outpost would write one of the war's most remarkable small unit actions. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment consisted of just 18 men under First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck Jr. Bouck had turned 20 years old just weeks before the offensive. He was one of the youngest officers in the entire division. His men were equally green. They had been assigned to a forward observation position on a wooded ridge overlooking the village of Lanzerath, watching a road that German forces needed to advance westward. The position was isolated. The nearest friendly unit was several hundred yards away. If the Germans attacked in strength, there would be no quick reinforcement. Bouck and his men were on their own. At dawn on December 16, Bouck watched through binoculars as a column of German paratroopers emerged from the morning mist. He counted them as they appeared, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. There were hundreds of them, perhaps 500 men from the 3rd Parachute Division, advancing in close formation along the road from Losheim. They moved confidently, apparently unaware that American eyes were watching their every step. Bouck faced an impossible choice. His 18 men were outnumbered nearly 30-1. Standard military practice would have been to withdraw, to report the enemy's strength, and fall back to a more defensible position. But Bouck's orders were to hold, and more importantly, if he withdrew, nothing would stop the Germans from advancing down that road and hitting the American positions from the flank. So he held. The German paratroopers advanced up the slope toward the American positions. They moved in the open, apparently believing the ridge was undefended. Bouck waited. He had ordered his men to hold their fire until the Germans were within effective range. The seconds stretched into minutes. The paratroopers came closer, closer. Then Bouck gave the order to fire. The opening volley cut down the lead elements of the German column. Paratroopers fell in heaps on the frozen slope. The survivors scattered, seeking cover behind trees and in shell craters, trying to identify where the fire was coming from. The element of surprise had been total. The Germans had walked into a kill zone. For the next several hours, the 500 German paratroopers launched assault after assault against Bouck's position. Each time, the 18 Americans drove them back with concentrated rifle and machine gun fire. The Germans brought up mortars and machine guns of their own. They tried to flank the American foxholes by moving through the dense forest. They sent men crawling through the snow to get close enough to throw grenades. Each attack failed. The frozen ground made it impossible for the Germans to dig in and advance methodically. The Americans had prepared their foxholes during the quiet weeks before the offensive, building firing positions with overlapping fields of fire. The terrain favoured the defenders, and Bouck's men, despite their inexperience, fought with a ferocity that shocked the German paratroopers. By late afternoon, the situation had become desperate. The 18 Americans had been fighting continuously for nearly 20 hours. Ammunition was running low. Several men were wounded. The artillery observer attached to the platoon, a man named Billy Queen, had been killed while directing fire support, but they were still holding. 500 German paratroopers had been stopped by 18 Americans who refused to give up. The stand at Lanzerath delayed the entire Kampfgruppe Piper advance by critical hours. Piper himself, waiting behind the paratroopers for the road to be cleared, grew increasingly furious at the delay. He had planned to be miles to the west by nightfall. His timetable called for reaching the Meuse River within 2 days. Instead, he was still east of his starting line, held up by a handful of men who should have been swept aside in minutes. When their ammunition was finally exhausted, when they had fired their last bullets and thrown their last grenades, Bouck ordered his surviving men to surrender. They had inflicted an estimated 92 German casualties, 16 killed, 63 wounded, and 13 missing. 1 American had been killed. 14 were wounded. The stand at Lanzerath would later be recognized as the most decorated American platoon action for a single engagement in World War II, receiving 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, and the Presidential Unit Citation. But recognition came only in 1981, 37 years after the battle. For decades, their extraordinary stand was largely forgotten. While Bouck's platoon held at Lanzerath, other elements of the 99th Division faced their own desperate fights. At Hofen, at the northern end of the division's line, the 3rd Battalion of the 395th Infantry Regiment held a position that controlled access to key roads leading north. The German plan called for seizing Hofen quickly and rolling up the American line from the north. It did not work out that way. The 3rd Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel McClernand Butler, had prepared their positions carefully during the quiet weeks before the offensive. When the German assault came, Butler's men were ready. The attacking German infantry walked into interlocking fields of fire that had been carefully plotted in advance. American machine guns swept the approaches. Riflemen picked off German soldiers who tried to find cover. Artillery fire, called in by forward observers who had pre-registered every likely assembly area, fell with devastating accuracy on the attackers. The result was a slaughter. 104 Germans were killed. 160 more were wounded. American losses amounted to just 4 killed, 7 wounded, and 4 missing. The soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, who would earn the nickname Butler's Blue Battalion Bastards after their commander, had stopped the German attack cold. Hofen became the only place along the entire American front where the Germans failed to advance a single yard on December 16. But elsewhere the situation was deteriorating rapidly. At Krinkelt-Rocherath, German forces pushed 99th Division units back into the twin villages. The 12th SS Panzer Division, joined by the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, attacked with tanks and infantry. American positions began to buckle. Communication lines were cut. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Small groups of American soldiers fought isolated battles against German forces that seemed to be everywhere. The confusion was total. German tanks rolled through the streets of the twin villages, their commanders uncertain which buildings held American defenders and which had already been cleared. American soldiers hid in basements and upper floors, waiting for German tanks to pass before engaging the infantry that followed. Firefights erupted at point-blank range. Men died in doorways and alleys and frozen fields. The snow turned red with blood. Salvation arrived in the form of the 2nd Infantry Division, one of the most experienced formations in the American Army. The 2nd Division had been attacking toward the Roer dams at Wallerscheid when the German offensive began. They were veterans of D-Day and the hedgerow fighting in Normandy. They knew how to fight. Major General Walter Robertson, the 2nd Division commander, received orders at 07:30 hours on December 17 to break off his attack and withdraw to Elsenborn Ridge. This was one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare, a daylight withdrawal in contact with the enemy, threading an entire division backward through another division's crumbling positions while both formations were under attack. Robertson executed it brilliantly. He organized his withdrawal in phases, with each unit covering the retreat of the units behind it. His veteran soldiers held open the routes through Krinkelt-Rocherath, while elements of the 99th Division filtered through their lines. It was chaotic. It was bloody. Men died covering the retreat. But it worked. The night of December 17 to 18 saw some of the most intense combat of the entire battle. American soldiers fought house to house, room to room in the twin villages. Sherman tanks, positioned in village alleys, ambushed German Panther tanks at point-blank range. The crack of tank guns echoed between buildings. Tracers lit the darkness. Burning vehicles illuminated scenes of desperate fighting. First Lieutenant John Granville, an artillery liaison officer, coordinated fire missions that brought the combined weight of 7 artillery battalions crashing down on German concentrations. Divisional batteries and corps, level 155mm howitzers, fired continuously throughout the night. The twin villages became a kill zone. illuminated by burning buildings and exploding ammunition. German tanks and infantry that tried to push through the American positions found themselves caught in a crossfire of artillery and direct-fire weapons. On December 18th, 5th Corps Commander Major General Leonard Gero made a critical decision. He placed Robertson in charge of both divisions, temporarily attaching the entire 99th Division to the 2nd Division. This created unified command over both battered formations at the critical moment. There would be no more confusion about who was in charge or which unit was responsible for which sector. During these desperate days, individual soldiers performed acts of extraordinary heroism. Technical Sergeant Vernon McGarity of Company L, 393rd Infantry, earned the Medal of Honor through actions that seemed almost superhuman. McGarity was wounded in the opening artillery barrage on December 16. Shrapnel tore into his body as shells exploded around his position. Standard procedure would have been to seek medical treatment and evacuation. McGarity refused. His men needed him. He returned to his squad and continued fighting. When German tanks approached his position, McGarity grabbed a bazooka and advanced toward the lead vehicle. The bazooka was a relatively primitive weapon, effective only at close range against the thick armor of German tanks. McGarity closed the distance under fire and put a rocket into the tank's vulnerable side armor, immobilizing it. The German advance in that sector ground to a halt. He rescued wounded soldiers under fire, crawling through shell-torn terrain to drag them to safety. When a German machine gun crew set up a position that threatened to overrun his squad, McGarity advanced alone. Using his rifle, he eliminated the entire crew, then turned the captured weapon against the Germans. He continued fighting as his squad's ammunition dwindled. Round by round, bullet by bullet, they held their position. Only when they fired their last shot did McGarity allow himself to be captured. He spent the remainder of the war at Stalag 7A until liberation in April 1945. President Harry Truman presented McGarity with the Medal of Honor at a White House ceremony on December 18, 1945. By December 20, American forces had consolidated on Elsenborn Ridge. This boomerang-shaped high ground rose over 2,000 feet above sea level, dominating the surrounding terrain. It was the westernmost ridge of the Ardennes. Unlike the surrounding forested uplands, sections of the ridge had been logged, providing clear fields of fire across the approaches. An attacker approaching Elsenborn would have to cross open ground under observation the entire way. Behind this natural fortress stood what would prove the decisive American weapon: massed artillery. More than 300 artillery pieces, one 55mm and one 05mm howitzers, 75mm guns, and 4.2-inch mortars were positioned to support the Elsenborn defense. American gunners employed innovative time-on-target techniques, coordinating fire from multiple batteries to arrive simultaneously on German assembly areas. A German unit preparing to attack would suddenly find itself engulfed in explosions from every direction, shells arriving from different firing positions at the exact same moment. At Monschau, proximity fuses received their first combat use in European ground warfare. These sophisticated devices used tiny radar sets to detect when a shell was near a target, detonating it in the air rather than on impact. The result was an airburst that showered shrapnel over a wide area. Against troops in the open or in shallow foxholes, the effect was devastating. Men who might have survived a ground burst that exploded a few feet away were killed by fragments raining down from above. All of the preparation work the 99th Division had done during those quiet weeks now paid devastating dividends. The positions they had built, the firing data they had calculated, the communication networks they had established, all of it came together into a defensive system that multiplied their combat power many times over. What had seemed like pointless labor in a quiet sector now saved lives and took them in equal measure. When German forces attacked, American forward observers called fire onto pre-selected coordinates with devastating accuracy. There was no need to adjust fire, no delay while spotters walked shells onto their targets. The coordinates had been calculated in advance. The guns were already laid on target. The moment German forces appeared, American artillery was waiting for them. On December 21, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division attempted an assault on the ridge. They assembled in a tree line several hundred yards from the American positions, preparing to advance across open ground. American observers watched them gathering. Artillery coordinates were relayed to the batteries behind the ridge, and then the sky fell. The German infantry were struck by artillery while still forming up. Shells exploded among the assembled troops before they could even begin their advance. The attack never launched. The survivors fell back into the forest, leaving their dead and wounded in the snow. On December 22, American artillery fired 10,000 rounds in a single day against attacking German forces, 10,000 shells, each weighing anywhere from 30 to 100 pounds, screaming down onto German positions. The bombardment continued hour after hour, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard for miles. German soldiers who survived the barrages described the experience as hellish. There was nowhere to hide. The shells seemed to find them wherever they went. Weather conditions had initially aided the Germans. Average temperatures between 22 and 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Heavy snow that made movement difficult. Dense fog that grounded Allied aircraft. Persistent cloud cover that prevented observation planes from spotting German concentrations. For the first few days of the offensive, the Americans had to fight without air support. But the weather cleared around December 23. As the skies opened, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers appeared over the battlefield. Armed with bombs, rockets, and 850 caliber machine guns, they hunted German vehicles and troops across the Ardennes. Tanks that had been advancing confidently now had to seek cover from aircraft that could destroy them with a single bomb. Supply convoys were attacked on the roads. Ammunition dumps were hit. Fuel depots went up in flames. The combination of artillery, prepared positions, and returning air power made Elsenborn Ridge virtually unassailable. The Germans had no answer to the massed firepower the Americans could bring to bear. Every attack was broken up before it could reach the American lines. Every concentration of troops was dispersed by artillery. Every attempt to mass armor for a breakthrough was spotted from the air and attacked. The final German attempt came on December 26. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division launched what historians have called a forlorn infantry assault against the American positions. They advanced across open ground toward the ridge, knowing that they were marching into a kill zone. They were mowed down by artillery fire virtually at the moment of their start. The attack collapsed within minutes. After that, the Germans made no further serious attempts to take Elsenborn Ridge. The price Germany paid in the northern sector was catastrophic. More than 4,000 German soldiers were killed in the fighting around Elsenborn. Over 60 tanks and heavy weapons were destroyed. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend lost 67 of its 136 tanks in just the first 3 days of fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath. Military historians have assessed that the division essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Kampfgruppe Paper, denied access to its planned routes through the Elsenborn area, was forced onto secondary roads that were never intended to support heavy armoured traffic. Piper himself described these roads as suitable not for tanks but for bicycles. His powerful battle group, which should have been racing toward the Meuse River, found itself stuck on narrow forest tracks that turned into muddy streams when the temperature rose slightly. Piper advanced only 46 kilometers west before being stopped at L'Église. His fuel ran out. His ammunition was exhausted. American forces surrounded him. On Christmas Eve, 1944, Piper ordered his men to abandon their vehicles and attempt to escape on foot. Of the original 4,800 men and 800 vehicles, only 717 men walked back to German lines on Christmas Day. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. Every tank, every armoured vehicle, every truck was left behind. American losses at Elsenborn, while significant, were far lighter than German casualties. The 99th Division suffered 465 killed in action and 2,524 evacuated for wounds, injuries, fatigue, and frostbite. This represented approximately 20% of the division's effective strength, a serious loss by any measure, but more than 90% of these casualties occurred during the first 4 days of the offensive, December 16 through 19, the period when the outcome was still in doubt. The casualty ratio tells the story. Outnumbered 5-1, fighting against elite SS Panzer divisions, the 99th Division inflicted losses at an estimated 18-1 ratio. This was an extraordinary achievement for any unit in any war. For a division experiencing its first combat, it was remarkable. The strategic importance of Elsenborn Ridge extended far beyond the local tactical situation. The Germans had designated 5 major routes through the Ardennes to reach the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp. These routes, called Rollbahns in German military planning, were essential for supplying the advancing forces and exploiting any breakthrough. Elsenborn controlled access to 3 of these 5 routes. By holding Elsenborn, American forces denied the Germans the road network they needed to sustain their offensive. The 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to form the main effort of the entire operation, found itself channeled into a narrow corridor that could not support the logistics required for a drive to Antwerp. Roads that remained open were inadequate for the masses of vehicles and supplies needed. Traffic jams formed miles behind the front as German units competed for limited road space. Elsenborn also protected critical American installations. Liège, just 20 miles to the northwest, housed major supply depots essential to Allied operations. Spa, where 1st Army headquarters was located, was directly threatened by any German advance through the northern sector. Verviers, a densely stocked railhead, was equally vulnerable. If Elsenborn had fallen, all of these locations would have been in German hands within days. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army on the southern axis of the German offensive, understood what had happened. After the war, he rendered his verdict on the failure of the northern shoulder. The German counteroffensive failed, he said, because our right flank near Monschau ran its head against a wall. Historian John S.D. Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied Commander, studied the Battle of the Bulge extensively. His conclusion was unequivocal. The action of the 2nd and 99th Divisions on the northern shoulder could be considered the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. While the siege of Bastogne captured the attention of the press and became the iconic image of American resistance during the Battle of the Bulge, military historians increasingly recognize that Elsenborn was where the German offensive was truly broken. Bastogne was important. The heroic defense by the 101st Airborne Division inspired the nation. But Bastogne was a blocking position that tied down German forces. Elsenborn was the wall that denied the Germans the routes they needed to reach their objectives. The 6th Panzer Army, rendered combat ineffective by its failure to break through at Elsenborn, was transferred to the Eastern Front on January 16, 1945. This date also marks the official end of the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed. The 99th Division's subsequent record validated their performance at Elsenborn. After rehabilitation, they returned to offensive operations in February 1945 and drove toward Cologne. On March 11, 1945, the 99th became the first complete Allied division to cross the Rhine River, seizing the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before its collapse. During April's reduction of the Ruhr pocket, the division helped capture more than 300,000 German prisoners. On May 3 and 4, 1945, troops of the 99th liberated subcamps of the Dachau concentration camp near Muhldorf, discovering 1,500 Jewish prisoners in horrific conditions. 600 required immediate hospitalization. The division ended the war on the Inn River at the Austrian border. Recognition came through multiple channels. The 3rd Battalion, 395th Infantry, received the Presidential Unit Citation for destroying 75% of 3 German infantry regiments, while outnumbered 5-1 at Hofen. The 1st Battalion, 394th Infantry, received the Distinguished Unit Citation. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, General Courtney Hodges, and Major General Gero all issued commendations praising the division's performance. Gero's letter to Major General Lyle acknowledged the achievement in stark terms. Despite extremely heavy losses in men and equipment, the 99th Infantry Division redisposed itself and succeeded in establishing a line east of Elsenborn. Your organization gave ample proof of the fact that it is a good fighting division. The division was inactivated on September 27, 1945, at Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia. The men who had held Elsenborn Ridge scattered back to their ordinary lives across America. They married, they raised families, they built careers. Most never spoke much about those frozen December days when they stopped an army. The transition from combat soldier to civilian was not always easy. Some men carried wounds that would never fully heal, physical and psychological scars that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Others found that the skills they had learned in combat had no application in peacetime. They had been trained to kill. Now they had to learn how to live. But they adapted. They became teachers and engineers, farmers and factory workers, doctors and lawyers. They raised the generation that would be called the baby boomers. They built the post-war America that became the most prosperous society in human history, and they did it quietly, without seeking recognition or praise for what they had done. The 99th Infantry Division Association held reunions for decades after the war. Veterans returned to Belgium to walk the ground where they had fought. They stood at the monuments and remembered the friends they had lost. They told stories to younger veterans, passing down the memory of what had happened at Elsenborn Ridge. As the years passed and their numbers dwindled, they worked to ensure that their story would not be forgotten. Monuments stand today at Krinkelt-Rocherath and Lanzerath Hill in Belgium, honouring those who fought. The 99th Infantry Division Historical Society continues preserving their legacy through research, battlefield tours, and a growing digital archive. The German misjudgment of the 99th Infantry Division was not simply a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. Hitler and his generals looked at these young Americans and saw what they expected to see. Soft, undisciplined, inexperienced soldiers unsuited for war. They did not see what actually existed. Men like Lyle, Bouck and Vernon McGarity and thousands of anonymous battle babies who would prove that preparation, terrain, artillery superiority and determined soldiers could overcome even the most elite enemy formations. The German High Command had assumed inexperienced American troops would collapse under shock assault. Instead, 18 men at Lanzerath held 500 paratroopers for 20 hours. A single battalion at Hofen inflicted 264 casualties while losing 4. An entire division in its first real combat fought elite SS Panzer formations to a standstill and then drove them back. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The generals who dismissed American fighting quality, who scoffed at these battle babies, who believed that German martial tradition would triumph over American determination, were not stupid men. They were capable professionals who let preconceptions override evidence. They saw an America they recognized from their assumptions and ignored the America that actually existed. The men who held Elsenborn Ridge were not supermen. They were farmers and factory workers and college students who had been transformed into soldiers in less than 2 years. They had never fired their weapons in anger before December 16, 1944. They learned to fight by fighting. They learned to survive by refusing to die. Lyle Bouck, the 20-year-old lieutenant who held Lanzerath, survived the war and returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke of what happened on that frozen ridge in Belgium. When recognition finally came in 1981, he accepted it quietly, noting only that his men deserved the credit. Vernon McGarity, the Medal of Honor recipient who fought until his last bullet was gone, returned to Tennessee after the war. He died in 1992 at age 73, having spent decades as a quiet reminder that ordinary men can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30, 1945, still convinced that his analysis of American soldiers had been correct. If Germany had lost, it was because the German people had failed him, because his generals had betrayed him, because fate had conspired against him. He never accepted that his fundamental assumptions about American troops had been wrong. The nation he had dismissed as soft had stopped his last offensive cold. The soldiers he had called incapable of withstanding shock assault had held against his finest troops. The division he had targeted as weak had proven stronger than his SS Panzer formations. The evidence was undeniable, but Hitler denied it to his dying breath. The story of the 99th Infantry Division at Elsenborn Ridge matters because misjudgment still costs lives. Leaders still see what they expect to see, rather than what actually exists. Assumptions still override evidence. The cost of such blindness remains as high as ever. Every generation faces its own tests. Every generation produces its own heroes. The men who held Elsenborn Ridge in December 1944 did not know they were making history. They were simply doing their jobs, holding their ground, refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. They proved that ordinary people, properly led and properly motivated, can accomplish extraordinary things. The German planners who dismissed them as battle babies made a mistake that military leaders have made throughout history. They confused inexperience with weakness. They assumed that soldiers who had never been tested would fail when the test came. They forgot that every veteran was once a green soldier facing combat for the first time. The question is not whether soldiers have been tested. The question is how they respond when the test comes. The 99th Infantry Division answered that question on the frozen slopes of Elsenborn Ridge. They answered it with blood and courage, and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. They answered it in a way that changed the course of the war. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive